My name is Hugh O'Neill, and I'm from Waterford City. And I was born in 1951, and I took up thatching in 1979. The reason I took it up was I'd been travelling for about a year in all over Southeast Asia, India in particular, and Afghanistan and Nepal. And from there, when I came back, I decided I wanted to make a career for myself. So I decided on thatching because I used to live near Dunmore East in County Waterford. So I seen a lot of thatched houses down there, and it kind of gave me some inspiration as to, this is an indigenous kind of skill, and I should be doing something like this. So I inquired about it at the time, and there was very few people thatching in Ireland. It was like seriously going down at that time, and most of the roofs, even in Dunmore, were in very poor condition. So I actually found a man in the west of Ireland called Jimmy Moran, and Jimmy was a traditional straw thatcher, and I got actually to work my apprenticeship under Jimmy back in 1979. And he was a straw thatcher, not a reed thatcher, which I am today. As a reed thatcher, most of my work is done in reed, but I can do a little straw. But the straw would have been more traditional for Ireland back in the early years, because every house, cottage, was thatched in straw originally. Bar in this area where I'm working at the moment is Lickettstown. They actually thatched with reed, strangely enough, because the reed was on their doorstep. It was in the river close to here. When you have a material that's on your doorstep, this is what people done in the past. They used what was to be found within maybe 5 kilometres of where they lived, because at that stage you would have remembered, like 250 years, people didn't have a lot to do with transport. So they relied on local techniques of putting things together, and they would have relied on certain individuals in the community. So it was kind of a metal system back in those days, where people came together and then they would put a house together very fast. And in some cases I heard of building houses overnight, because if you could build a house overnight, you didn't have to pay tax on it. Penalising aspects to all these cottages. So if you look at the size of the windows on these cottages, they're very small, right? And one of the reasons was that you were taxed on the window size. And I've seen even cottages in the west of Ireland where chimney was even taxed. And this would have been during penal days in Ireland, right? So the window the chimney was non-existent on the roof, but there was a gap up at the top of the ridge of the roof where the smoke could go out through the roof. And I'm not surprised why they call it the black thatch, right? Because inside you can imagine this room kind of full of smoke, and slowly releasing the smoke out of the room through this gap on the top of the roof.
Just to save on taxes.
Just to save on taxes. But it was just the way it was, So the idea, like say for example, the half door on Irish cottages was to let in light, but it was a door, so they weren't taxed on the door, because during the daytime they would have the daylight coming in. So there was all ways around beating this system, but it was restrictive because you lived in a dark house basically, most of the time when you were inside. But most people lived outside of the cottage during the daytime. It was only in the nighttime that they would have really spent time around the cottage. Well, when I came here first, it was about 10 years ago, and the original owner, who has since passed away, he actually got me to do 2 hips on this roof originally. That's my connection with her. And then over the years it's been slowly going down since, and there was a lot of holes in this house, in the roof itself. The birds had actually nested inside, so they went through the old thatch very easy for some reason, and there's a lot of crows basically in this vicinity here, so they played havoc on the roof. And I tried to just keep on shoving bundles into it and plugging the holes, and now eventually we got to the stage where he got approval for the grant from the county council, and that has made a significant difference to making this man hold on to his thatch roof.
I think the
maintain these buildings and to keep them in use. I think they're ingrained in our culture, really, in a way. They're almost like the physical embodiment of our culture, really. So this building that we have here is over 200 years old, and it's quite a subtle piece of architecture, really, a piece of vernacular architecture, which is not, it's not like the formal architecture we would get in cities and towns, but it's part of our landscape. I suppose it's the direct result of a community coming together to construct a lot of these buildings. The building itself, as I say, it's over 200 years old. It's part of our vernacular architecture in County Kilkenny. And when I say vernacular architecture, I mean that it's a local architecture with local materials, with local craftspeople that were involved. So the materials themselves, they all would have come from the locality. The stone is local, the lime mortar would have been burnt locally as well, then the clay was local, and of course then the water reed on this project is nearby from the River Suir. So the materials and then the craft as well. So the craft of thatching is really, it's one of these crafts that is, I won't say has died out, but it's been challenged year on year. We're losing thatch cottages, so to have a thatcher like we have here, a master thatcher involved in this project is really great.
Most of my work was actually, in the early years, was up in Sligo. So I had a fantastic experience of Sligo as a county back in that period. Beautiful place, and lots of scattering of thatch cottages in different parts of the county. So I spent a few years there, and then I've done a number of jobs down in Connemara, and then I went back down to Waterford, which was where really I came from. So I wanted to kind of get a more regular kind of work in the one place. So Waterford had quite a few houses in Dunmore East, for example. So I got my first job in Dunmore East after travelling around, and then I actually found that I was getting regular work in Dunmore East. So that was great. I was able to, feel at home, because most of my friends and people I wanted to be around were down in Waterford. And as it turned out anyway, you're still having to leave base on a regular basis because there's not enough work on a constant level. So you've got to be prepared to travel with this kind of a skill. Traditions of thatching varied a little between the west and the east. And you have a distinct style in, say, for example, Wexford. They thatch with straw, but they had very high-pitched roofs, and they had a system of actually kind of shoving the straw into the old thatch, which is what held it onto the roof. So they didn't use what we call scallop thatching. Scallop thatching was a kind of a widespread practice of thatching in Ireland. Not so much in other places, but Ireland had a distinct style in that sense. And we have even an Irish saying, which is "Ní hé lán na guithe lán na scallop." The windy day is not the day for thatching. So that'll tell you how much the relevance of thatch was to people, that they even had a proverb. These are hazel scallops, and they're twisted to form those U-bended, as you see there, and pointed on each end. So that would go through the thatch. We call this scallop thatching, which is a traditional Irish method of holding on thatch onto thatch. So these scallops are driven into the old thatch, so they get the grip in the old thatch. And if the grip is not good, it means that the thatch is not really well held down, so you'll have to be able to say, right, you can see there that's got a fairly good grip there. Some places might have it, so I might have to reinforce it. I won't know that until I try it out later. Like here, there's a mud wall going up along the side here, and that's a kind of a problem sometimes, because to get a grip on that mud, you can't get a grip on the mud because it's hard and it's not going to grip into anything. So you might have to go further into the thatch here, like there, and that might not be good enough because it's too soft. It's a bit better up there, but it's no good down there. So there could be issues on a roof like this because of that. And the same here. So I might even have to strip off some of this just to make sure I can get that grip. Now I might just reinforce that there. See, that's part of the original timber that's protruding through. Now I might be able to grip on that afterwards. If I can use that to my advantage by maybe putting another piece of wood down here, I'll have to check that. But there's always issues when it comes to an old roof in terms of, is the grip going to be there? The West of Ireland style would have been, say, Donegal, Connemara. They used a lot of ropes to hold down the thatch. It was very amateurish in the sense that it wasn't a kind of a technique as such. It was kind of basically put up on the roof in a very simple way and netted over to cover it. And then the high winds, obviously, that you would have in, say, the Aran Islands and Donegal, they would be, you know, you'd have to protect it. So everything was roped into the wall all around. Very elaborate roping system, but very simple thatching system. They'd thatch a house maybe 2 days, and it would be obviously a collection of people throwing it up and putting it into place. And then you had, like say in Waterford and Wexford, the roofs are kind of much more hipped style. They're a variance of more of a tradition, I'd say, that had maybe a cross coming over from Britain, from Cornwall or Devon or somewhere like that. You could see that there was a distinct appearance on that style. And whereas the West of Ireland, you had gable, straight gable roofs most of the time. And thatch was more simplified. And then underneath the thatch, in the West of Ireland, you would have had scroll to hold on that first layers of thatch. And it was kind of an insulator as well. And the scroll was taken from the mountainside and it was put over the rafters. And then the thatch was put on top of that with the scallops, holding it down. And whereas down in this part of the country, they would have stitched it all on with sugon rope. That was the technique that they held down their first layers of thatch. And then they would have probably used scallop thatching after that.
My name's Michael Kennedy. I'm a boat builder and shipwright, but I've done a lot of work on historical buildings and medieval structures over a number of years. Just looking at the inside of the thatch here, the structure under that is displayed underneath the thatch. The first thing you notice about it is the sugon ropes coming down, attaching the thatch to the structure. This is, we call these pieces here purloins, and the main frame you're looking at across here we'd call a truss, with the main rafters coming up supporting the thing, and the absolute minimal structure, but very successful. I mean, this thatch could be 200 or 300 years old, and it has actually survived that time. It's very good use of material. It is in terms of like the age, a lot of this stuff is regrowth 25, 30 years old, whereas, you know, if you got into bigger structure or machined timber for that, you'd be taking trees down that are 80 to 120 years old. They could cycle their usage a lot quicker, like every generation they'd be able to harvest, and they'd basically walk up the road and find material to do their roof. There's not a lot of planning as such. They'd have had a basic wall width, a basic height. They'd have worked all the rafters in so there was a similarity in the main rafter trusses going through, and then they'd have built it organically. They kept adding pieces up, you know, until they had their structure to go with. You know, they wouldn't have spent a lot of time cutting stuff up and fitting carefully, you know. So it worked well for what they were doing, because they'd have had a group of neighbours putting up a building. You know, you'd have given your neighbour a hand and he'd have given you a hand. So there was a pool of labour in a small community, and a certain level of craft too, you know, because they had a very good idea of what they were doing, and what they needed to do to produce a building.
Well, when I'm working on an old roof, I only actually know how good it is or how bad it is when I start stripping off X amount of thatch off of it. And sometimes, okay, you can get an appearance from the outside, but it doesn't reveal actually the true story until you start stripping off that thatch. Then you find either the person who worked there before you done a good job on pre-packing it to make it stronger if there was weakness there from a previous time. So there's a whole series of layers that you're working on. You're working on what was there from the previous thatcher, whoever done it before. And that would determine as to how bad or how good that roof is. So in this situation on this particular roof, I would have ended up going back into the original timbers on it. That's the last thing any thatcher wants to see when he works on a roof, because he has now to build that back up again. And maybe in some cases like this roof here, I had to replace timbers that were gone. Now you're trying to find like with like, so you have to find those replacement pieces. Like in this case we used ash, and ash had to be debarked to put into that position. So that protects the roof for the long term, the future. But it's unique in some ways to be doing that, because most cases the roofs have not been neglected that much that you go back to the original. And I actually kind of try and evaluate how much, like in this case here, I had to strip all the eave completely off and leave it on the front of the house. So that was extra work. But look, it's to get the results at the end of the day, you have to do it. Otherwise you're not going to have a good fixture on that roof. So when I'm touching this, I like to get a nice soft line around here that I can see a shape, and then bring it back up around here. This is the traditional type of Irish hip that we have. And I've left this wall here and I cut back the level of thatch there so that I don't have to strip off too much here, because I definitely would like to have reed here all the time if I could. Well, when you look at a roof, you've got to evaluate what actually needs to be done to it, if anything needs to be done to it. But what I try and do is I say, right, okay, by the appearance I generally have a good idea when I look at it, and I say that's been taken care of or it's been neglected. If it's been neglected, you've got to kind of evaluate as to what needs to be done to it to maintain it, right? Most houses, most roofs that are done now, they're lasting for about maybe on average about 30 years upwards, right? You should be able to get close enough to 30 years minimum, but depending on the pitch of the roof. If the pitch is very good, the longer the thatch is going to last. So you try and improve sometimes if you can, and if you have the chance of redoing the roof, right, rethatching from taking it back to the base coat again, and that's a big job in itself, just to say, right, okay, that has to be done. We're going back to rethatching it, and when you start, you're looking at, say, right, okay, you have to measure it, and you have to kind of take into account how many bundles are required for that roof. Now, on average, we work it out at 1 bundle per square foot, depending on the size of the bundle, but that's the average.
Is it a bundle of reeds?
A bundle of reed, and it takes actually. I used to have reed harvesting machines in the past, and I know it's hard work actually collecting all this material in, because it's quite significant on the house. It's about maybe, for an average cottage, it's about a container of reed, and that's a sizable amount of reed, and it takes about maybe for 1 bundle, maybe or 250 bundles to an acre of land to grow. And this is all wetland, so you have to kind of go down and harvest it on the river and take it off the river and then bring it onto land and then clean it out. So there's quite a lot of process involved in it. But what we do now, most people are thatching. Back in the early days I couldn't do it because there was no one supplying the material. I had to do it myself. So I invested in a machine, a particular kind of machine that harvested it. It's called a rice harvester. And it gathered in the material and then it made it into bundles, but then you had to clean it out afterwards. So that was very handy back in the days when no one else would supply me the material. Now today, most people are supplied by someone who's actually harvesting it. They will actually, there's one person who supplies imported reed, mostly imported reed, and he's based down in County Waterford, and he brings in sizable amounts of it every year for thatchers. I buy from a local farmer down in Limerick because I like Irish reed, and I like, particularly with heritage, I like to kind of say use local as much as possible. And I get it from the one supplier over the last maybe 12, 14 years, I'm not quite sure exactly, but he supplies me with a regular, consistent amount of reed that I need for the year. So I'll run one of these along here. There's a bit of a weakness here, see if I can get enough of grip. This part is particularly important because this is where I'll probably get the fix to take the next layers that are going to go over that roof. So if I can get a good grip here, generally I can find I'll get a good grip further up. Hitting something there. Now I'll put a mallet to that and that will tighten it in. You hear that nice tuddy sound, you know you're going somewhere with it. This kind of technique that I'm using here really has been around for hundreds of years, and it hasn't changed on old houses, but with new houses it's a completely different system. So as I said to you, it's called Scallop thatching in Ireland. Now you can see that it's solidified that whole base there that I need to get a grip on later. The material gets dressed up with this tool here, which is called a legget, and that pushes the material up. And when the bundles are laid and they're opened up and they have to be done properly, this does all the hard work. In other words, it catches these butts and it shoves them up like this, and it shapes the thatch. You would never do that with your hands because your hands would be ripped by even trying to do it. So you can get them up so far, and it has to be level in general, or it has to have a certainly well knitted in together. You won't get it perfectly level, but you can get it level enough. And this does all that. So when everything is nice and tight and close to one another, you shouldn't really be able to even, it's not easy to pull out that. That's got such a grip now at this stage that any kind of a storm, be it a hurricane, wouldn't affect that because it's so well stabilized. But to get that, I had to stitch on the layer on the bottom all the way along here, which you don't see because that's covered over now. But it exposed the timbers that were on the inside. The fact that they were exposed means that now you have to fix a layer of thatch specifically over those timbers to get the grip on the next bundles that are going to go over it with the scallop thatching. So at this stage you can see that that's very well held down. So what happens is when all of this is finished off, the water hits that material, and it's on the outside it hits it, and it runs down the thatch. And the penetration is only a very small amount into the actual thatch. So it's only the wear really on the outside. The inside never gets wet. And particularly where you can't afford it to get wet, because then the fixings could get destroyed if it did get wet. So the fixings are well inside of the roof. So each drop that comes off of that is just running off of it. It's a great insulator as well. It's a great sound insulator as well as an actual insulator, because you don't hear the rain on the outside when you're living on the inside. So there's a lot of advantages to it. Most of the Irish cottages originally were thatched in a very simple kind of barge to barge kind of style, and variants on that would be, let's say, a hipped roof, right? So the hipped style, as I said, comes mostly from the south of the country. And you have, for example, like in Dunmore East and County Waterford and County Wexford, you have quite a few roofs with hips. You might find them as well in other parts of the country, but not as common. So the barge style is more common in the west of Ireland. But over the last number of years, people put up new houses and built features into roofs. And most of those features are windows mostly, whether they're dormer windows or Velux windows or whatever. So they would be the other features that would be put into a roof. But they generally have issues unless they're really well designed. And it's often that the simple roof performs the best because the water is just running straight off of it. And that's the whole idea. So you have less problems with a straightforward roof than you do with a kind of a featured roof. Now, they look very attractive from the point of view of looking at them, but they don't perform as good because there's water being channeled into certain parts of that roof. So I try and tell people, keep it straightforward. If you want longevity out of the roof, that's the best approach. If you want a beautiful roof, be prepared that you're going to have more maintenance on it. The rods that were, as I described, most of the scallops are made from hazel because they're longer lasting and they're great grip on them as well when you put them into the old thatch. And you can get a split hazel rod, which is probably the most effective because that has even a better grip than the round hazel. And you could use on average on, say, a roof, you could use 5,000 of those on a roof. So it's quite a lot of preparation involved in it, and they have to be pointed and they have to be pushed in the right way into the roof. And they also got to get the grip good. So if you fail to get a good grip, you'll have slippage, and that's a problem. And what you need to know is maybe you need a second grip. You might need to hold that fixing down further up the roof. So I do that on a regular basis on an old roof because I want to make sure that there's no problems with that roof. I did mention that there's about 4,000 of these to make up the whole roof on average of this size of roof, and this is not a huge roof. But if the condition of it was really bad, you could put in a lot more just to make it firmer and better. So what I'll do now in this case is I'll put up a second rod to give it a grip further up. Now you can hear even sometimes the thatch to grip. If you hear that kind of crunchy noise, it's generally good. You've got a grip there. If you don't hear any noise, sometimes it's just going through and there's a thud there. So that's good. Now in this case, I've broken the scallop here. I'll take that out. In this case, I didn't have to take off a section here, which I had to do all along here. So that's helped me, and that's good. Okay. Now I'll put in another one up here. And bang those home. Nice kind of thud sound there. That's good when you hear that. So then you're starting on what we call the brow course, where you're turning the corner of the eave. So the bundles are kind of shaped before they're put up. Makes it easier then for work. And then they're pushed in close to another. Temporary held down. You do a lot of temporary work until you do the final work, the final fix. So I get another bundle for the side here. Put on a kind of a lighter reed, a finer reed, which gives me that easier shaping to do. Whereas if I have a bulky reed there and it goes on first, it creates problems further up. So I try and stick with what's lighter. And then I get my temporary fix on. Sometimes I use the steel to do that, it's much handier. And put this across. And then you do kind of an integrate job. Now you can see the second fix, the grip is even getting better. And take out some of these temporaries. And next thing is to start integrating them together. Opening up the strings. Then you got to do a certain amount of handwork on the second layer. When this is only preliminary work, really. So you get that into shape. Just clear the area. Look underneath. Get the level. And that's kind of maybe not quite the exact level, but at least you can come back over it afterwards and do the final touching up on it. And this is the start of the brow course there. The materials have basically been the same, the tools are much the same, except that modern tool making, they can make a tool like this which is cast out of aluminium, and all those rings, they catch the reed. Now, someone obviously designed this. It was very clever the way it was designed, because it's quite simplistic to actually do the casting on these later, and there's a nice little bit of weight which is good, so when you're shoving up the material, it's done a lot of the work. The weight is doing a lot of the work for you. So it's important to have the right tools. Without this tool, you're not going to successfully do a thatch job. When I started off originally thatching, I was taught by an elderly man who was a straw thatcher. And he used to just use a mallet made from teak or hardwood. And he'd have grooves cut out in it. And those grooves would catch the material like that, right? But it was very small. Here I have a tool that's designed specifically for that purpose. It's got about three times the width almost of that mallet, and it does it very fast. So what I was doing in the beginning, because I was none the wiser, I was using what the old man showed me, and then I followed from there on for a couple of years, and then I realized, no, this is like, there's got to be something better than this. So in England at the time I went over and I'd done a course over in a place called Knoxton Hall. It was a week course, which was very interesting because it actually showed me what techniques they were using on their houses, and also kind of taking in features and aspects of the roof that we didn't have in Ireland. So a lot of modern thatching that was done in Ireland, say from the 80s, early 80s, right up till the present day, where people put new thatch roofs up. We were able to combine those elements of what they were using in England, because most of their roofs are stripped off completely when they're thatched. They don't have what we call here now is the scallop thatching. If they do, it's only in certain areas where there's straw thatching, but not where there's reed thatching. So this technique of holding on the thatch onto new roofs is it's a much more simplistic way of doing it than scallop thatching. With scallop thatching, you have to have everything right. With the new methods that they have now, it's fairly foolproof in terms of getting a good finish on the roof. Whereas with an old roof, you have to look at the craft, and you have to weigh up a lot of things that are going on in that roof. So it's much trickier to do an old roof, but it's much more enjoyable, because when you do the old roof, it's like bringing something back to life again. Whereas with modern stuff, unless the design is really nice, it doesn't do anything for me personally. But my grow is for the old roofs really, because you turn them around, you put them back and you preserve them, and that's nice. You can see it's going to last there for another maybe 40 years before it has to be redone. So that's what you're hoping for, is to get preservation going with these roofs, that people will hold on to them. You have the ridge on top of the house, the building. Sometimes it's called the book down in this particular part of the country. Well, that has to be generally replaced in Ireland every 8 to 10 years. Now in England they use a sedge, which is a longer lasting material, but we just don't have access to it here. And they probably get maybe 15 years or 20 years out of it. But like, that is the maintenance area on the roof. And if you don't maintain that, you have problems with water maybe getting in and undermining other layers of the thatch, because that's the final layer on the top. And we have different ridges as well. We have like the Irish tradition in the past was, as I spoke earlier, it was with straw. With a straw bobbin ridge, that was the traditional Irish ridge. Now no one is making those straw bobbins. I can make them, and I'll show you afterwards how they're made. But the performance of those ridges are very good, and that's the system that I learned when I was beginning to thatch with Jimmy Moran, because he was a person who used all this particular technique of bobbin ridging, and it's particularly distinct for Ireland, this bobbin ridge, and it sits very well on the roof, and it looks very well on the roof. So this is a stook here. A stook of straw, and this came out of the roof. This was up on the gable ends of the roof, so I'm going to possibly recycle it for something at some stage. But what we do is we'll make some bobbins from this. So I'll just open up a bundle and I'll show you how a bobbin is made. This is an Irish bobbin. So what normally happens is you pick out a piece of straw about that amount, and you can actually move it slightly there, and then you start twisting it. And then you gather in and you wrap it around again and again, and you make a bobbin. And that's an Irish bobbin there, right? And these are put together on the top of the ridge, and they're put down. There's a rod put through them, and the rod holds them all together, and it's like a skirt, putting up skirts at a time. So I'll just make another couple while I'm there. It has to be tight, otherwise they won't be effective. And then after, when they're all done, you can take off all the loose straw there. And they look nice and neat, and then they put down. And just one more for that final. Touching a ridge is probably the important part, because it's the part that everybody sees when they look up at a roof. That ridge always stands out, and so most of the ridges today are raised ridges. The flush ridge is more of a traditional type of ridge, but a lot of people want the raised ridge because they feel it shows off that part of the roof much better. There's a lot of emphasis now put on the design work between the ridge, on the ridge. Say for example with the way the patterns are A lot of people like a herringbone pattern or something that stands out. That's nice, but there is going to be issues with all of ridges because they do break down faster. They're exposed more to the elements outside, and they get X amount of years, and then those scallops start to breaking down. So, yeah, there's the maintenance on it, and then what normally people do is they net it as a result of that. So by netting it, you hold the ridge further in place, less chance of it slipping, and that kind of, protects it against the birds as well, and high winds. Because as soon as those scallops go on the ridge, the wind can lift off the thatch in that area. Now, generally, thatch is a good performer against wind if it's not weak. If it's strong and it's well put up, it should stand up to even hurricanes. It acts like a shock absorber when it's with all the little holes that are there. It filters down the wind, so it prevents the full impact of the wind against it. So it doesn't lift it like slates can be lifted off of a roof or tiles. Thatch, it actually filters it, so it can be quite good as long as it's not sticking out. Like features can often get hit because they stick out, and the wind can get it from different angles. It's amazing to think that Sugon rope is up there for that amount of time,
and that it lasts.
And it lasts, yeah.
And the other thing,
well, if it's kept dry, you see, if anything organic like that is kept dry, it'll last indefinitely.
Yeah, and the Sugon was probably made in the yard out there.
Probably.
Twisted.
And it's they just feed it out and you reel it in.
Okay.
On like if you had a brace, those hand braces.
Yeah. Keep twisting.
Keep on twisting it.
Yeah, there's a Gaelic song about it.
The Sugon.
Bothy Bon used to sing it.
The Bothy Band.
Yeah.
What was it called?
Cossack and Sug or something like that.
Oh yeah. It was in Irish, wasn't it?
Yeah. What's the Gaelic?
Yeah.
Well, that's just to hold it, and we'll put a nail in it. A lot of the nails you see would have been made on a farrier's forge, braiding. They'd just beaten out, but they tried to use as little nails as possible because there wasn't that much iron around.
Things were fairly bad, Michael, weren't they?
Well, it's just
for going for materials outside of the norm. Yeah.
But I mean, the braiding a nail was. Once you had a forge up, you'd make a nail in about 60 seconds.
Yeah. No, it's a beautiful interior as an original.
Yeah.
You'll see different states and different types because it'll vary from one place to the next, but to actually find something that's opened up like that, that's authentic, is rare.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of it, is that you see how it's actually put together. You can see all the structure, you can see the thatch, the Sugon, and the means of how they fixed it as well.
Yeah, well you see, they were originally, when the pink whitewash on the fireplace, see the way it goes all the way up to the top?
Yeah.
Which means the ceiling was never there. Not in this room, I don't think they ever had a ceiling.
No, they never had a ceiling in any of it, until recently. I'd say it was back in the 60s or 70s.
Yeah, they put a ceiling into that room and that room, but they left the ceiling out of here.
Yeah. But you see the way it goes in the way, where it comes close to the chimney, Michael, you see that? Instead of putting it directly on a level with the rest of it, they dropped it.
Well, they needed to make the flue narrower,
well,
as it went up. But a huge fireplace for a small dwelling.
It's actually extraordinary big, isn't it?
Yeah.
But
and quite complex too. Do you see that?
I see that. Yeah. Well, they probably had a blower. They had one of those air blowers,
Yeah.
Pierce of Wexford used to make those.
Yeah.
But they would have been much later. That's kind of when bit of modernisation came in.
Yeah.
I came over to Ireland to work for Microsoft, and I'd never been to Ireland before, and apparently my ancestors were from Kildare, and I just felt at home in Ireland, And then I visited Kilkenny and found it to be a very friendly city, and decided I liked this area, and then decided I was going to live permanently in Ireland. So trawled through the internet, found the cottage, came down to have a look round, and it was a beautiful day, and just fell in love with the place. It was magic, really, because it was a lovely day. It was lovely and peaceful. The scenery around here is gorgeous, and from living in Dublin and working there, it was just relaxing. First instant, you just relaxed, and it was so tranquil. And I thought, this is where I want to live for permanently. Well, it was built, the first recorded of the building itself is something like 1813, 1820. But prior to that, it was known as the hunting lodge for the local landowner. Oh yes, it's always been a thatched. In fact, when I bought it, one of the blokes that worked for me said, "Oh, I know a good roofer. He'll put," I said, "No, you can't. It's history. I mean, this goes back over 200 years of a thatch, and I wouldn't change it at all." A couple of years ago, it started to leak on some areas, and the crown was sinking down. So I was considering getting it all re-thatched itself, and quite fortunately, Francis Cody from Kilkenny Council, he visited, and he said, "I'm so pleased you've still got the thatch." And we had a really nice chat, and I made inquiries about grants for thatching, and the housing department, they give a grant, but when you look at the total costs of thatching, which can be up to like €20,000, it's an expensive project. And the housing department, their grants are very good, but doesn't go a long way towards financial assistance. And with the protected building grant, it was far better. So, and Francis Cody in Kilkenny Council was so good and helpful. And so about 2 years now, 18 months, 2 years ago, I had the re-thatch and brought the crown back to its original way. So what you see now on the thatch is what it would have been like 200 years ago.
There's two conservation grants. Again, they're handed down by the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht, and we're quite successful in Kilkenny in the amount of money that we get for homeowners. So it's they're a yearly conservation grant that are provided. So one is the Historic Structures Fund. It's quite a large body of money, which for projects that would have a community benefit. And then there's the Built Heritage Investment Scheme, which is this project here qualified for, is for smaller scale repairs and maintenance on protected structures and buildings of architectural merit. I think the best thing to do is to contact the planning authority, and specifically the architectural conservation officer if they have one in their local authority. So obviously in Kilkenny we have myself in that role, which is great, so we can dispense advice and guidance on conservation grants, but also on appropriate materials and appropriate contractors and the like as well.
The most common response is the insulation. It's cosy in the winter. On a hot day, you sit inside, it's really cool and refreshing, and you close the doors and the windows and you do not hear anything. I have an extension with a flat roof, and I'll go through to the extension, and you can hear the rain drumming down on the roof, and I didn't even realise it was raining. But that's the practical side. It's when you come home, and especially on a sunny day, it's like a living entity. Welcome, there's this honey glow on the roof, and it's just so welcoming, and you think, I'm home, and it's just peaceful. It makes you relax, and it takes all your worries away just looking at it.
There's a couple of reasons why people have continued with thatch. So a lot of people like the aesthetics of looking at it, for starters. And then on the other side, you have very good insulation values in thatch. And the appearance obviously is a big plus because most people are curious about it. I think myself that if you look at, say, a house that's already got a history of being thatched, you'd say, right, okay, to remove that thatch is almost like criminal, in my view, because this is the house that was built for that purpose. So I think with the Heritage Council, with the heritage bodies that are there in each council, and the support system that's there as well from the heritage end of it to maintain these roofs and keep them, rather than let them fall in and see them removed from the landscape. I think this is a fundamental thing that we have to be serious about in the future. If we want to preserve heritage, we've got to actually say it's out there and then do something about it and put in support systems there to support the people who continue to work with this, and also the people who live under the roof where they can get a support, because that's very important, because naturally it's handmade and it's going to be not like buying something from the hardware store. You have to organise it, you have to have a commitment towards it. And I think most of the people now who are maintaining the roofs are doing a very good job on it. The workmanship in general, right the way through the country, is being upskilled all the time. There's better quality work being done. Maybe it's away from the original appearances of what the houses were, but at least it's preserving these houses.
I came down to look at this project probably about 18 months ago, and there was quite a lot of reed had fallen off the roof, and there was a lot of crows on the roof, and there was water starting to get into the building. The walls were starting to break down at the heads of the walls, and now we come back here over the last number of weeks, and you can just see the quality of the workmanship, and the work that's happening now is going to safeguard this building for 20 or 30 years, which is fantastic. The building will be reused as opposed to a vacant building, and that's a positive as well.
There's a legacy with all these houses generally, and they've been passed down from one generation to another generation, and whether they're maintained is the other issue in between. This is the important part, that we can still see a future for them, and they're different and they're unique, so preservation is really important, that we can have a policy there that the government can support, maybe bring in more money into the heritage end of it, look at what's out there and see what's been threatened. Like there's a lot of houses in this vicinity here that have old roofs on them, and I can see that they're going to need a lot of attention, and the people who have those roofs are not living in these cottages, and that's part of the problem as well. If you were living under the roof, you would have a value on it, but when you moved away from that house, the possibilities are it can go into disrepair very fast. So it would be fantastic if they could actually make an inventory of all these houses that are out there that are threatened in particular, and see is there any way that they can be preserved for the future. And in this case here, I must take my hat off to the owner here, who would love to see it continued as a thatch roof, and he's not living in it, but as I said, maybe someday he might be living in it, who knows.
Maintain the heritage of Ireland and keep the thatch. Initially it's very daunting, and if you get a good thatcher like Philip Doran, he did my thatch from Laois, he really is an artist, and that's what it is. It's not just a job, it's an art form, and he did an excellent job on this. I mean, he liaised with farmers to obtain the straw before a project, and that worked out very well. And it's really a lot of hard work for him and an art form, but there's about 4 acres of straw on the roof of the entire cottage, so it's well worth it. And when you've finished it and you arrive home on a sunny day and you've got this warm honey glow, it's, you know, you're home.